Kenya, of course, is between 10 to 11 trillion. The reason why you can't say about debt with certainty, now in the markets, exchange rates is changing. So the debt in the morning is different from the debt in the evening. So it's around 10 to 11 trillion. The only thing I want to isolate there, because I was talking about debt, why can't we borrow? Because all the other growing economies borrow anyway. And we have empirical evidence to show that the US debt to GDP ratio is over 120%. That Japan is over 260%. And Kenya is below 70%. And especially by using the nominal GDP of 18 trillion. Why can't we borrow? Then why can't we as economists then come up with a theory in a paper, those who are doing masters? Borrowing as a tool for economic growth. Why can't one of us then come up with that kind of a paper? And I'm giving my opinions. I am not an authority per se. These are my opinions. Japan. You know, unless the policy maker wants to borrow, they say big economies are borrowing. And they cite the US, the UK, and of course Japan comes in handy to justify. But you have refused to go that route. Why? Currently the US debt is over 32 trillion Kenya shillings, the US debt. But then in borrowing, number one, you look at the use. When you borrow, this money is going into doing what? Because if you are borrowing and the money cannot generate more money within the economy, then stop borrowing. And that's what we are precisely doing. Number two, you look at interest rate. Our domestic debt as a composition of the entire debt and the external debt is 50-50. So when you talk about 10 trillion debt, 5 trillion is domestic, and 5 trillion, give or take, is foreign. Out of that, our major debt, which is foreign, is dollar denominated. So when you have a variation in currency, which you may not have a lot of control when you are in a floating exchange rate regime, then you are trying to borrow and jump into a hole where you don't know it is up to what depth. So that's one of the reasons why we cannot continue perpetuating over borrowing. Because we don't have a lot of control over the gymnastics around exchange rate. Second, and maybe the last, because the rest you know, Japan. If you study the economy of Japan, since 1994, for 30 years, the GDP of Japan, in real terms, economics, you know you have real and nominal. If you deflate the Japanese economy, it has not grown in real terms for 30 years. But then, why am I saying that? How is it related? Japan has a 260% debt to GDP ratio. But why can't we compare ourselves with Japan? The major thing is this. Two, cost. Number one is cost. Number two is something I'll call net off. Cost. Do you know Japanese government does business with borrowing? Do you know part of how Japanese government raises money is the business that I'm talking about of debt? If you check, you can Google later. Before COVID, there is a time you could buy a 10-year bond, a Japanese 10-year bond at negative interest rate. Can you imagine? In Kenya now, we are talking about infrastructure bond of 18%. Japan, negative. That's one, cost. Second, net off. Can you do for me empirically how many countries Kenya has lent money? Kenya is a debtor, but is it a creditor? Or the other way around? Just tell me, because you are economists, how many countries has Kenya lent money? Anyone with an idea? Maybe silence means if you don't know. Look at Japan. When we are talking about the US having 32 trillion Kenya shillings in public debt, the number one external lender of the US government is Japan. But at what rate? Now you try to see. How much have they borrowed at? How much have they given the US at? That's the reason why comparing a thriving, growing economy to those in terms of borrowing, you only do it when you are lazy. So when you see me on TV one day justifying we are borrowing because Japan is borrowing, no, these guys have started to be lazy. Because there is no comparison. Let me come to the close by the last point. As we think now as economists, I'm just provoking ourselves. We have read many theories in economics. Mercantilist, we know them. That trading alone makes a lot of sense in economic growth. We have read about physiocrats. Physiocrats, they say, no. Agriculture is the main thing in economic growth. That the only productive sector in an economy is agriculture. Because the others, you only transform the factors. But then, why must we focus on as economists? This is my opinion. Looking at the US, the UK, the Asian tigers, one thing that we must continually improve in Kenya, in Africa, in all developing countries is capital accumulation. If you look at Kenya, how much capital is allocated to every Kenyan who is a worker? Look at Japan, for example. Look at Germany. Germany, you see capital per worker per person reached optimum many years ago. So the most they can do is to maintain, because there is no more growth to do in terms of capital per worker. If you look at all those economies, including China, when we talk about China in manufacturing, we are basically talking about accumulation of capital. Because the major component of manufacturing is capital itself. Because then you look at Kenya, for example. The reason why we are agrarian now